Hi Jody and everyone in GRI. If you don't know already, my name is Alexandra Aniban, but I prefer to go by Alex. I am currently a sophomore at the university and I'm pursuing a neuroscience degree. A little bit about myself. So I was born and raised in Colombo, Sri Lanka, which is like a tear-shaped island on the Indian subcontinent, to a full Sinhalese mother and a mixed race but mostly Filipino father. So when I grew up, the only way I was able to really communicate with both my parents is to speak English. So unfortunately, I was never really able to learn either of my languages, even though I was surrounded by Sinhalese culture on a daily basis. I mean, luckily, it didn't really detract too much from my Sri Lankan identity. It just kind of made me more inclined to stay quiet, like for during family functions, which we had a ton of, by the way, or like during times when we would talk about Sri Lankan holidays or Sri Lankan history. I just didn't feel like I could 100% involve myself in that culture because I couldn't even speak Sinhala. So I was like, can I really call myself Sri Lankan? Even though I was only like maybe 6 at the time. And on the other hand, I didn't have any kind of connection really to my Filipino identity because I really only knew my dad and then maybe a couple of his coworkers. So that was the only kind of interaction I had with that culture, and therefore, like, I kind of didn't really identify with it at all because, again, I didn't have any kind of exposure to it. So even though I am technically biracial, like, I honestly consider myself more Sri Lankan than anything. And even then, I was having trouble calling myself like full Sri Lankan because I couldn't fully identify with everyone else that I talked to. So, in moving to the US, I don't know if any other immigrant can tell you the same story, but from my experience, moving to the US was like, oh my God, the US, it's America, it's a land of opportunity. There's so much culture there, there's so much diversity. Like that was moving to the US when I visited in the past that was the first time I've ever seen Black people, first time I've ever seen Hispanic people. So I was exposed even then. To America and the fact that it did have a lot of diversity. So I was proud in that way to move to a place that fostered like I guess a positive identity. Of course, I did know at the time the racial tensions and the socioeconomic tensions and all the other things. I was only 8 years old, but so moving here made me really, I guess, like grateful for being who I was because then I could share that with other people. Um, and at the same time, the classmates that I encountered when I enrolled in public school were also interested in who I was and in my culture. They didn't really understand it because none of them were Indian or Sri Lankan or Pakistani or anyone else, any other South Asian country. But they were just like, oh, this is cool. I like that you're different and I'm going to accept that. But this was, of course, at a young age. So I mean, it's not really at the time where you, I guess, like foster certain racial stereotypes, even though sometimes I would get comments about how thick my eyebrows were or the fact that I had, big lips, or my hair. My hair was definitely a topic of discussion a lot. People always thought that it was really frizzy and unruly, and I was like, what can you do? Even my father, who obviously is Filipino, kind of just told me like all the time, like you need to fix your hair, you need to make yourself look more presentable and what in some way. And I feel like in that sense, he was trying to take away part of my racial identity, part of my Sri Lankan identity, because my appearance it's very much leaning towards Sri Lankan. Any person from the Philippines or from Sri Lanka could tell you that, but. Yeah, my dad telling me things like you should straighten your hair or you should do this and that made me feel like, oh, I'm maybe I shouldn't really consider myself Sri Lankan, or maybe I shouldn't like foster so much of my Sri Lankan identity. I should try and move towards like either an American identity or more of a Filipino identity, even though he didn't really expose me, like besides through food and certain holidays, to that kind of culture. So that kind of ideology led me in high school, or in middle school and high school, to kind of like put aside my Sri Lankan identity and kind of just really embrace like my American identity. So obviously the way I talk, I have an American accent. A lot of the ideals I have are very American, even though I have a Sri Lankan foundation. I honestly don't remember too much about my Sri Lankan identity because I'm so used to, at this point, identifying as American. And I know that's something that we talked about in class, the cross digression theory. I believe it's the first stage, um, which is like kind of the pre-encounter. So that's you just being like, okay, I'm not black. But in my case, it'd be like, I'm not really Sri Lankan, I'm American. Even though I literally came from Sri Lanka and lived there. So it was definitely like something I had to juggle a lot in middle school and high school, like having to like not only straddle the lines between Sri Lankan and Filipino, but also straddle the lines between like foreign and American. Another problem that I came across, and I didn't really realize that this was a thing until I guess high school and even until now, but the idea of my like racial commodification. So obviously we've talked about racial capitalism in class, and the idea behind that is that people are making profit off of like a racial identity. So in my case, the things that I saw were like people putting random heads of Buddha, or Buddha, I guess, for Americans, like as a mantelpiece, or as something on their wall. And to me, that's really disrespectful. First of all, because having just the head of Buddha is like saying, it's like showing a decapitated version basically, but also because you're taking a part of my culture that actually means something, that actually that people like Sinhalese Buddhists actually worship, and you're taking it and you're turning it into this like little trinket, this little decorative piece, and it doesn't mean anything to you. And besides that, like bindis, for example, I mean, bindis have been a fashion accessory for a really long time, but the fact that if I wear a bindi, I'm gonna probably get a lot of looks if I walk around campus. But if, for example, a white girl who wants to go to Coachella wears a bunch of like little bindis and it's looking really nice, she gets no slack for it. But how come I do? Like, why is it that when white people take a certain part of the culture, a certain trait, for example, Kylie Jenner and her infamous lips, how is that okay? Like, how is that okay for them to take that and not receive any slack? Rather, they'd be celebrated for it, like they'd be exalted for it. Whereas if I try to do that, if I try to embrace who I am, I'm shunned, or I am rejected in some way. So it kind of, that bugged me when I was in middle school and high school, because I couldn't really embrace myself, whereas I saw other people taking parts of my culture, like, for example, all the things that I mentioned, and they wouldn't get anything for it. So I guess, like, as a solution for kind of my identity problems, especially being a biracial person who identifies with more with one race than the other, that I, one, should accept and kind of reacquaint myself with my Sri Lankan identity and get back into the swing of things, and also to just like explore my Filipino identity, to ask my father about Filipino customs, and get to know my Filipino relatives, because otherwise I'm gonna be in this like I'm gonna be floating around in this headspace for the rest of my life, not really knowing, at least when it comes to race, my identity. I know my gender identity, I'm pretty sure I know my sexual identity, but when it comes to race, and because race is so intimately tied with culture, I am always gonna, at least until I like really delve into that, I'm always gonna have like some sort of ambiguity, and it's really not something that I'm comfortable with. So I guess that's what I'm gonna have to work on. I'll let you know how it goes, and yeah, that was kind of awkward.